In this video, we are going to create a simple 2D dungeon generator in Python Tkinter. So taking a look at the demo here real quick, we're on the first level of the dungeon, and the red dot, the player, is on top of a blue tile. Blue tiles represent stairs that go up, and green tiles represent stairs that go down. The green downstairs can be used to access and generate new dungeon levels, while the blue upstairs can be used to access the previous dungeon level. The starter code here creates a root window for our project and imports the random module, as we'll be using that later on. If you run the code, you should see a blank window. The dungeon is going to be drawn onto a canvas, so we'll create a class called DungeonCanvas. Then inside of the root class, we're going to initialize, display, and then update the dungeon canvas. If you run the code, you should see the black canvas inside of the root window. Our first step to generate a dungeon is to fill the player's current dungeon level with walls that we can later carve empty rooms into. To start things off, we're going to create a player class and give the player XYZ coordinates. Then we're going to initialize the player inside of the dungeon canvas. Next, we're going to create a dictionary of tile colors. 0 represents floors and 1 represents walls. Now we'll set a dungeon level size and create an empty array for the dungeon map. Next, we'll add a method called generateDungeonLevel to DungeonCanvas and call the method fillLevel with walls, which we'll create next. Inside of fillLevel with walls, we'll start off with creating a new list for the current dungeon level, or Z position. Then we'll iterate through each Y position inside of the Z position and create a new list also. Next, we'll iterate through each X position inside of the Y position and place a wall or 1 there. We'll make sure the Y list is stored inside of the Z list, and that the Z list is stored inside of the dungeon map list. Now we're going to add a method called drawDungeonLevel and clear the canvas. We only want to draw the dungeon level that the player is currently on, so we use the player's Z coordinate to get that level. Next, we're going to calculate the tile width and height. Then we're going to iterate through each XY position and get what type of tile goes there and what color it should be. Now we're going to calculate the tile rectangle's coordinates and then draw the rectangle. We're going to call the drawDungeonLevel inside of the generateDungeonLevel method. And finally, we're going to call the DungeonCanvas's generateDungeon method inside of the root class. If you run the code, your canvas should be filled with gray walls. The next step is to place rooms inside of the dungeon level. We're going to set a min and max size for the rooms inside of the DungeonCanvas class. Next, we're going to set the max number of rooms we want to generate. And finally, we're going to set how many failed room placements can occur before we stop attempting to place new rooms. Now we're going to create a method called placeRooms. We're going to get the last Z level in the dungeon map and create a new list to store the rooms in. Then we're going to set variables that keep track of how many rooms we've generated and how many times a room wasn't able to be placed. Now we're going to create a while loop that loops as long as there are less than the maximum number of rooms and less than the maximum number of room placement failures. Inside the loop, we're going to choose a random tile, which represents the center of the room we want to place. We'll then give the room a random width and height. We can now calculate where the room starts and ends on the map. Then we'll check if the room is within the map bounds. If not, we'll increase the failure count. Next, we'll check if the room overlaps with any other rooms by creating a doesOverlap method. Then we'll call the method inside of the placeRooms method. If the room does overlap, we increase the failure count again. If the room passes both checks, we can officially add it to the map. We'll also add it to the rooms list we created and increase the room count. Finally, we call placeRooms inside of the generateDungeonLevel method. Now, if you run the code, you'll see rooms of various sizes placed around the map. Each time you run it, the map should look different. Now that the rooms are generated, we have to connect them by generating corridors between them. To begin, we're going to add a method to the dungeon canvas called connectRooms and then iterate through the rooms we added to self.rooms. We'll get the room that matches the current index and then the room after it. Next, we'll get the center tile for each room. Now we'll create a corridor between each center tile by creating another method called createCorridor. We'll be passing in coordinates for the center tiles. Then we'll create an if statement that chooses a random boolean. If we get back true, then we're going to start creating a horizontal path from the first tile until it reaches the second tile's x coordinate. Then we'll start creating a vertical path until it reaches the second tile's y coordinate. Now we'll add an else statement for when we get false. Here the opposite happens. We'll start creating a vertical path and then move on to a horizontal path. Finally, we'll call create corridor inside of the connect rooms. Then we'll call connect rooms inside of generate dungeon level. Now if you run the code, you'll notice that the rooms are connected to one another by corridors. Now we'll randomly place an upstairs and downstairs on the map. That'll allow the player to move between dungeon levels. First, we'll add 2 new entries to the tile colors dictionary inside of DungeonCanvas. Blue is for upstairs and green is for downstairs. We'll also create an attribute called staircases. We'll be storing the stairs for each dungeon level in this list for easy access. Now we'll create a new method called place stairs and start off getting the dungeon level we're currently generating. We'll also get its current index as we'll be using it later. Then we'll create a while loop and select a random XY coordinate to place the stairs at. Next, we'll determine what kind of tile is at the XY coordinate. If it's a floor tile, we'll update the tile type to an upstairs tile. Then we'll store the XY coordinate in an attribute called upstairs. We'll do the same for the downstairs. Next, we'll store the upstairs and downstairs inside of the staircases attribute as a dictionary. Finally, we'll call place stairs inside of the generate dungeon level method. Now if you run the code, you should see a blue and green tile on the map for the upstairs and downstairs. The next step is to draw the player character onto the map. When the player starts out on the first dungeon level, they should be standing on the upstairs tile. So we'll add a method to DungeonCanvas called placePlayer to handle this. Next, we'll call placePlayer inside of generate dungeon level. Now we'll add a method called drawPlayer to DungeonCanvas and start off with removing the player from the canvas if already drawn. Then we'll calculate the width and height of the tile that the player is going to be drawn in. We'll set a scale to determine the size of the player character and calculate the circle's diameter. Next, we'll calculate the circle coordinates. We'll then draw the player using the DungeonCanvas create oval method. Finally, we'll call drawPlayer at the end of generate dungeon level. Now, if you run the code, the player's circle should be drawn on top of the upstairs tile. Our final step is to add player movement. To begin, we'll add a method called movePlayer to the DungeonCanvas class. We'll pass in XY values that'll be used to calculate which tile to move the player to. Before moving the player, we'll make sure that the new tile is within the map bounds and not a wall tile. If it passes these checks, we'll update the player position and draw the player. Now we'll add key bindings to the arrow keys inside of the root class that will allow the player to move. If you run the code, you should be able to move the player using the arrow keys. Now we have to give the player the ability to use the upstairs and downstairs. Starting with the upstairs, we'll add a method called movePlayer up to the DungeonCanvas. We'll check to see if the player is standing on the upstairs tile. If the player is on the first dungeon level and they decide to use the upstairs, we'll just close the program. Otherwise, we'll move the player up a dungeon level and place them onto that level's downstairs tile. Then we'll draw the dungeon level and draw the player. Moving on to downstairs, we'll add a method called movePlayerDown and check to see if the player is standing on a downstairs tile. We'll move the player down a level and check to see if that dungeon level has already been generated. If it hasn't, we'll generate the level. Next, we'll place the player on that level's upstairs tile and then we'll draw the dungeon level and the player. Finally, we'll add bindings to the shift and up keys and the shift and down keys that move the player up and down the stairs inside of the root class. Now when you run the code, you should be able to freely move between dungeon levels by using the up and down stairs. Okay, so now you should have a simple dungeon generator. The full code is in the comments, and thank you for watching.